Good evening and welcome to this webinar. My name is John Leggett, and as Mayor, I'll be giving an overview of tonight's presentation. The presentation will be recorded and will appear on the Marlborough District Council website. The purpose of this presentation. Submissions are now open for the public to comment on whether Marlborough District Council should raise a loan to finance Port Marlborough share of the Waitohi Picton Ferry Precinct Redevelopment. The consultation period closes on the 4th of February 2022 and submissions must be lodged by 5 p.m. on that date. A formal statement of proposal, which is a requirement of the Local Government Act 2002, has been available since the public consultation period opened on the 17th of December 2021. This presentation will build on the consultation document and will be followed by Wednesday the 19th of January, a public consultation meeting at Endeavour Pavilion in Picton, commencing at 7 p.m. Public drop-ins in Blenheim, the Whitehaven room of the ASB Theatre, and in Picton at the Endeavour Pavilion on the 18th of January 2022. The presenters tonight will be Mark Wheeler, Chief Executive, Marlborough District Council, who will cover Marlborough District Council role and process, including the Dublin Street overbridge and upgrading of Waitohi culverts. Rhys Welburn, Chief Executive of Port Marlborough, who will summarise the project, business case and the risk mitigations. Kiwi Rail Project Managers Stephen O'Keefe and Massimo Soprano, who will cover the new vessels and the environmental and navigational gains. Both of these presenters will be presenting remotely, Stephen from Auckland and Massimo from Melbourne. Luke Grogan, Harbour Master, who will cover navigational safety. Laura Skelton, Senior Transport Planner, Marlborough Roads, who will cover future ferry traffic effects and mitigation. She will also be presenting via Zoom. Martin Fletcher, Chief Financial Officer, Marlborough District Council, who will manage the Q&A part of tonight's presentation. And on this, any questions or comments, please use the chat function on the screen. We will be providing written responses if we cannot adequately deal with any questions tonight. And Mark will cover this in more detail shortly. So to summarise, the public has already had a say on the Ferry Precinct's new design, including better connection to the Picton Town Centre. This consultation on the precinct's design and community requirements has been led by Port Marlborough and Kiwi Rail. So now the consultation tonight is about whether to finance the port's share of the project to achieve these goals. We encourage submissions, so please put pen to paper and make sure you meet the deadline. We welcome and encourage submissions. I'll now hand over to Mark, who will commence his presentation.
Thanks, John. As you've said, this is a very important investment. It's actually the largest single investment the council group has contemplated. Project planning and design has been several years in the making, and I want to commend the Port Marlborough and Kiwi Rail teams for their very professional approach to this. The size of the investment meant it's been quite complex and difficult at times, but they've come through with the proposal that we're now looking at. So it's now for council to consult the community and get your views before making a decision to invest the 110 million or not. So I'm just going to provide an overview, and then our following speakers, as the Mayor has said, will go into more detail. Following our other speakers, we'll run over some of the online questions that we've got, and we'll just run through to 9 o'clock maximum if we need to go to that time, because I think everyone will have probably had enough by then and need to have a break. And as the Mayor said, if we can't answer these questions tonight, we'll go over them in the next few days and get back to you. Right. So our role in the process involved here, which will just come up on the slide on the screen shortly. Yeah, this diagram firstly explains the ownership structure of Port Marlborough. Council is the ultimate owner of Port Marlborough via MDC Holdings. Back 2 slides. No. Have a bit of trouble with our slide order here, so just go back to that 2nd slide. So, and one more. So the investment required by Port Marlborough is $110 million. Council would be proposing to borrow this from the local government financing agency and on lending that to MDC Holdings in Port Marlborough. That requires approval under the Companies Act in the case of MDC Holdings and the Local Government Act in terms of council requirements. And council has to consult before making that decision. So you can see the process there. The mayor's already run over the timeframes there, so we won't repeat that. We don't need to make a decision until we've had hearings, until we've received all the submissions by the 4th of February. We'll then have hearings and then we'll make a decision on the 4th of March. If you've got any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to contact Port Marlborough District Council. My name and numbers up there. Martin Fletcher, our CFO, is up there, and Reece Wellborn, who will be talking shortly, the Chief Executive of Port Marlborough. Or just send an email through to that Port Consultation address. So Council has been considering the objectives of this investment and the outcomes we want to achieve. And obviously there are benefits and there are always costs. So I've listed the key benefits up there, and this is just a summary of those benefits. They're not only financial, but they also provide certainty that the ferries will continue to operate from Picton with improved infrastructure for 30 to 60 years. Of course, it is a national transportation route, and this agreement and this funding will ensure that that route is protected and future-proof for the whole country's benefit. But we've got to make sure that it suits our community as well. Kiwi Rail will be paying Port Marlborough for the assets that they need by way of lease and rentals, and we're guaranteed a minimum 30 years before the investment is reviewed, or for the lease term is reviewed. And we will see, as well as the benefits of this project, we'll also see improvements to Picton infrastructure, and I'll touch on some of the traffic and culvert improvements later. Obviously, there are funding costs for council, who is the lender of the money, and we're also satisfying ourselves that all the other costs involved are being adequately recovered by Port Marlborough. We're also considering project risks. So some of the key risks, firstly, that Kiwi Rail may be unable to pay the lease. Now, that's something we've got to consider, of course. However, there are controls on that. So the government has invested heavily in this project. They've invested over 400 million in the new ferries. They're investing in the rail infrastructure. They consider it nationally critical infrastructure. A parent company guarantee is being provided by the Kiwi Rail Group and a bank guaranteed letter of credit. Because we're unable to get a full government guarantee, the initial proposed investment by Port Marlborough has been reduced as well to just limit that risk. So we believe we've got adequate controls on those risks. Stranded assets. Now, these are assets that, if at the end of the term of the lease, Kiwi Rail decide that they're not going to carry on with Port Marlborough's investment, using that investment, those assets, we've got protection in the lease, which Reece will cover in more detail later, in terms of those assets that might be stranded, and we'll get a payment for those assets that we're left with. So we've got protection there. Asset procurement on a very major consultation project like this, that is complex. There are many risks to address, and the risks are normally negotiated by and shared between investors, contractors. In the current COVID economy, we give even more attention to these risks because supply chain uncertainty is a key consideration. So Port Marlborough has negotiated a very good fixed price for the assets of the loan. but they'll be built by KiwiRail's contractors. So KiwiRail will build the assets, take the risk on the pricing, but provide a quality that Port Marlborough has quite a bit of control over to Port Marlborough and then lease them back. So we believe that's a very strong package in terms of procurement risk. Council needs to ensure that the interest costs of the loan that's needed for that investment are recovered fully with a risk margin by the rental payments made by KiwiRail. The methodology used to calculate the rental and careful matching of the borrowing term with rental reviews will cover that risk. And again, Reece, I think, touch on that returns a little bit more. We borrow through the local government financing agency, and they borrow in the same and similar markets internationally and locally as the New Zealand government. Bank borrowing is much more expensive than borrowing through the local government financing agency. Council has recently had its Standard & Poor's credit rating review, which takes the IREX risk into account. And Standard & Poor's, of course, internationally recognise they credit rate governments and major companies all around the globe. They were satisfied that we should retain our AA rating, AA plus rating, which puts us among the top 5 or 6 councils in the country, just behind the New Zealand government. Standard & Poor's will be keeping a close eye on our investment levels and on our credit, but at this stage we've retained that AA rating. We would need to drop several categories before council borrowing costs where other capital programs would be affected. So that's a really good outcome, and again, gives us some confidence. The simplest way to explain the returns to be received from the investment is to look at the projected dividends, and you can see the graph there. You can see from this graph that an increase of almost 3 million per annum occurs by 2031. In addition to the dividend that's paid by Port Marlborough Council, Port Marlborough will also retain additional profits and recover depreciation. They total by 2027 $7.5 million per annum, and will ensure that a $110 million loan is paid off within the first lease term. So that again is another strong risk avoidance mechanism. We're getting sufficient rental, sufficient dividends to reduce the loan at an acceptable rate. On top of that, the current ferry related assets are at the end of their life. If we do not reinvest in this project, current ferry dividend revenue of well over $1 million per annum might disappear. So as well as the project overall, which I've sort of touched on and Reece will develop further, we've also negotiated some specific separate agreements with KiwiRail to mitigate some of the consequences on the community. And longer trains or more frequent train trips will occur when you have more trains coming off any one ferry with these bigger ferries. So that was recognised early in the project negotiations, and KiwiRail have provided formal assurance that a Dublin Street overbridge will be built as part of the project. No port or council funding will be required for that overbridge, and that will ensure that an east-west cross-Picton link remains available at all times. KiwiRail was discussing the effects of the construction with affected residents, and that will continue through the construction of the project. Those of you who live between Nelson Square and Dublin Street will know that it is flood prone. In 2004, there was extensive flooding, and I was involved in the emergency response, and it was quite scary and quite extensive. As well as flooding, sewer overflows, and a lot of inundation of businesses and houses, and a civil defence emergency was declared. We've made some small improvements since then, but a major increase in the triple culvert system, which runs through the rail yards, is necessary to provide an acceptable flood risk, which should be a minimum 50-year return period. The culvert consent expires in 2026, so the sensible time to upgrade is during the reconfiguration of rail yards necessary for the project. KiwiRail, Port Marlborough and Council have agreed on that in principle, and on a 2/3 KiwiRail, 1/3 Port Marlborough cost share. Legal agreements are being prepared, being worked through at the moment. As I've said, presenters will now provide further project details. We'll just reinforce that we'd love you to make a submission. If you have a view, you can go to our website and read more about the project. You'll also be able to go to the website after this session and in the next day or two have a look at this webinar. Any questions, please click into the Q&A part or the chat part and answer and put your questions through. We'll try and answer as many as we can at the end of the presentations until 9 o'clock, or else you can email that email address there and that'll be dealt with. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Rhys Roberts.
Yeah, my pleasure to introduce Rhys, who'll run through a presentation for us.
Kia ora koutou, ko Rhys Roberts tōku ingoa. I'm the CEO of Port Marlborough, and thank you very much for joining us on the webinar. So, as Mark said, I plan to take you through some more detail about the project overall and take you through the commercial deal that we've negotiated with KiwiRail, and that should help to inform debate on the best way to fund the project. The first question, though, that we need to address is why is Port Marlborough investing in the first place? Well, there's actually several reasons. The first and probably the most obvious reason, though, is that there are 2 new large ferries being built due to arrive in 2025. KiwiRail will discuss the new ferries in more detail, but it's worth noting that they've been specifically designed for the Marlborough Sounds. The ferries are more efficient, they're more environmentally friendly, they have better manoeuvrability, and they're also rail enabled, so they have other benefits to the wider road and rail network. The main thing, though, is that they are larger than the existing ferries, and as such, the port needs to upgrade its facilities accordingly to be able to accommodate these new ferries. But the new ferries are really only part of the reason for investing. The reason behind the decisions to upgrade the ferries lies on the importance of the Cook Strait connection to the entire country and the supply chain. The Cook Strait connection is an extension of State Highway 1. It's the main trunk line. Without it, essential goods and services can't reach their destinations in time. This is particularly true of fast-moving consumer goods that fill supermarkets across the country, both North and South Island. In showing how important the connection is, the government has backed KiwiRail and the RX project to provide better resilience for this key supply chain route. The RX project has 3 parts. It's the new ferries, new infrastructure in Picton, and new infrastructure in Wellington. Overall, it's a $1.4 billion investment. And Port Marlborough's investment is a small but important portion of this overall project. So not only is the Cook Strait connection important to New Zealand, it's also vital to Marlborough. The ferries are an economic driver. They bring jobs and business opportunities directly from their operations and indirectly from tourism and flow-on benefits to Picton and the wider region. As a region, we fought really hard to keep the ferries in Picton, and our new agreement would now see them anchored to the region for at least 30 years. And finally, the last 2 reasons for investing are that the time is right for investment and opportunities abound for Marlborough within this project. The existing ferries need replacing. The infrastructure in Picton needs replacing. Some of the original infrastructure in Picton was actually designed for the Aramorana back in the 1960s. The Aramorana was 5 times smaller than the existing ferries. Roll-on, roll-off ferries have been visiting Marlborough for 60 years now. And now's the time for us to build new landmark facilities for Marlborough to be proud of for the next 60 years. And through that, there are opportunities. There are opportunities for us to partner with iwi and to partner with the community for some wider benefits along the way. So those are the reasons for investing, but what is the Waitohi Picton Ferry Precinct project overall? Well, as I said earlier, it's part of a much larger project to bring resilience to this important supply chain. The Picton portion of IREX will be around $360 million of the $1.4 billion. And it's a partnership between KiwiRail, Port Marlborough, Waka Kotahi and Marlborough District Council. As per the resource consent and the consultations already done previously, there'll be a new wharf, new berth development, new passenger gangways, a new car park and landscaping area, a new ferry terminal building, upgrades to marshalling areas, improvements to the road network, and of course, demolition of the existing assets. That's the big picture for Picton. But Port Marlborough's investment is a fixed fee of $110 million. That will cover the port assets needed for the new ferries. Importantly, all the assets have been designed for better seismic capability, sea level rise, and to meet the excellent rating of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. That's the leading method in Australasia for assessing environmental performance of projects. So the assets that the port will get for its investment of $110 million are the new wharf, berth development and dredging, new seawalls, new passenger walkway and gangway, and an upgrade to the car park landscape. So what is the commercial agreement with KiwiRail? Well, Port Marlborough has been in negotiation with KiwiRail on the commercial terms for several months. And it's been supported by a team of experts from Castalia, our economic advisors, to Bell Gully, our legal advisors, and others. The agreement on the table is a 60-year term of 2 periods of 30 years each. The agreement allows for a fixed price investment by Port Marlborough, capped at $110 million. It allows for KiwiRail to procure, construct all of the assets, and that KiwiRail will provide adequate securities on our investment. In return, KiwiRail will pay a fixed annual fee based on the size of our investment and on agreed inputs, including our WACC and depreciation period. The agreement allows for the commercial inputs to be reviewed regularly to ensure that it aligns with market conditions and so that there's transparency and fairness for both parties. So what does Marlborough get from this investment? Well, as you know, Port Marlborough pays an annual dividend to the council, which ultimately benefits all of Marlborough. Last year, this was $3.4 million, and we project around $3.5 million this financial year. So in short, what Marlborough will get from this investment is a better return from Port Marlborough. In investing, Port Marlborough is able to increase our dividends steadily over time, rising to over $6 million by 2030. In doing so, Port Marlborough would look to borrow funds through the Marlborough District Council. Port Marlborough will pay all fees associated with this loan, plus it will pay interest on the loan and will pay down the capital and get to pay high dividends to Marlborough District Council, which ultimately benefits all of Marlborough. So, Marlborough gets a return on investment. Better facilities, but what are the risks? Well, throughout the project, we've taken a risk-averse approach. We've been mindful of the following key risks. The first risk is really in KiwiRail's ability to pay the fees in the future. We call this counterparty risk. There's a lot of reasons to think that KiwiRail is a stable company and therefore a good investment partner. They're backed by central government. They have a new funding mechanism through the National Land Transport Fund, which KiwiRail can expand on later. KiwiRail's invested $1.1 billion into the overall IREX project alone. Since the 2017 earthquake, the Crown has invested nearly $1.5 billion in restoring road and rail link connections to the South Island, and so are committed to road and rail and the ferry connection. And overall, KiwiRail has received commitment of over $8 billion since 2017. On top of that, Port Marlborough has also got some additional protections in place. We've reduced our investment to reduce the exposure to the overall risk, as Mark discussed earlier, but also to ensure the affordability of the fees to KiwiRail in the long term. We have a parent company guarantee from KiwiRail, and we have a bank guarantee from KiwiRail. The other risk that we looked at was what we call a stranded assets risk. That's what would happen if KiwiRail does not renew at the first term of 30 years. To mitigate this risk, we've done several things. First and foremost, we've only invested in non-specialised assets. So an example of this is that we haven't invested in the rail link span, which is specific to the rail ferries. Rather, we've invested in other assets such as the wharf, which can be used for other things. We've also negotiated what we call a balloon payment based on the strandable components of the assets. So ultimately, if KiwiRail weren't to renew at the 30-year mark, they would pay a fee based on the percentage of the assets that we feel are strandable. We front-weighted the fee, and what that allows us to do is to repay the loan before the end of the first term too. So with all of those things, we think we've got adequate securities around the risk of counterparty and stranded assets. The next main risk is around project construction costs being higher than originally anticipated. We call this procurement risk. To mitigate this risk, we've agreed that Port Marlborough's contribution will be capped at $110 million maximum. KiwiRail have agreed to procure all of the assets, and as such have accepted all cost escalation risk and all programme risk. And this makes sense from an overall project point of view, because KiwiRail have got more control over the arrival of the ferries and more control over the programming. Port Marlborough retains a governance role to ensure that the quality measures that we want will come out in the final construction. So, what are some other frequently asked questions? Well, one that we've heard a couple of times is, why can't Port Marlborough pay for it directly or borrow the money directly? Well, the first part of that question really is quite simple. We don't have $110 million just hanging around on our balance sheet. And if we did, we'd probably get into some trouble, because it would mean that our balance sheet is pretty lazy. We intend to provide good return to our shareholder, and that means we need to leverage our balance sheet to make investments with good returns, balancing the risks. The agreement we've got on the table meets that balance, and it provides a good return with additional flow-on benefits. The second part of the question is an option for us. Port Marlborough could borrow the money directly. However, as we're solely owned by the Marlborough District Council, it means that the debt would still appear on the Marlborough District Council's balance sheet, on its consolidated balance sheet ultimately. That means that really the risks to the Marlborough District Council would be similar. We would also have to borrow at higher rates of interest than we can through the Marlborough District Council. That in turn would mean that our return to the shareholder and therefore the ratepayer would be smaller. So for us to borrow directly, there's no advantage to Marlborough. Some other questions we've been asked is, what's happening with the cruise industry? Well, Port Marlborough is working with relevant agencies to look at the sustainable return of cruise to Picton. We've always said that the eastern side of the New Berth would be a good location for cruise ships of up to 300 metres. It's closer to town, there's no need for shuttle buses, and it reduces congestion and pollution. But the $110 million that we're looking to fund the Waitohi Picton Ferry Redevelopment project will not be used for cruise, and a separate business case will be needed for us to make any investment in cruise. We will, though, look to future-proof the eastern side of the New Berth for cruise, because it would be silly not to. So finally, in conclusion, we have a new agreement on the table. That new agreement anchors KiwiRail to the region for at least 30 years. It will bring millions of dollars to the Marlborough economy. It provides for a more environmentally sustainable ferry operation. It delivers high return for lower risk than the current contract that we have. And it provides greater sustainable dividends to the shareholder and Marlborough region overall. For us, this is a must-do project. It's a must-do project for New Zealand, it's must-do for Marlborough, it's must-do for Kiwi Rail, and it's must-do for Port Marlborough. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and we really hope you support us by having your say and giving us your feedback. So that's the end of my part of the presentation, and I'll hand now over to Stephen O'Keefe and Massimo Soprano from Kiwi Rail.
I'm just going to click them on there.
Thanks, Reese. I think we're just waiting on my video to go on. Just checking, are we? There we go. Thanks very much, Reese, and thank you, Mark and John, for introducing the purpose of this consultation, but also really the context around IREX, the overall project, and giving myself and Massimo Soprano, our ships program manager, to talk to you and ultimately answer questions as we support MDC in this important consultation. If we can just pop to the next slide. So as Reese has highlighted, you know, the Cook Strait connection is a really important part of New Zealand's transport network, both in terms of freight, passengers, private vehicles, and tourists. As it says there on that slide, it operates 3,800 services a year, sailings a year. And so it's a very important part of moving freight and people around New Zealand. And so we haven't entered lightly into this overall program to upgrade the ships and the terminals on both sides of Cook Strait. In fact, I've been working on this project for a little over 2.5 years, and Kiwi Rail has been working with central government, Marlborough District Council, Port Marlborough, Centreport here in Wellington on this project for much, much longer than that. It's really important to have done a lot of planning and design and understanding our costs up front before we start building anything. And in fact, you know, have done a lot of work before we made the decision around what ships to have constructed for the business. As Reese said, the Waitohi Picton redevelopment project is one part of the overall program. The other is the equivalent infrastructure here in Wellington. So the redevelopment of the Kaiwharawhara Wellington ferry terminal for Kiwi Rail, and also, of course, the ships. And Massimo Soprano will take us through a bit more detail on the ships. It's fair to say that rail in New Zealand has experienced somewhat of a renaissance until a number of years ago, so maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Really, the rail infrastructure across the country was in a state that we would have called managed decline. We didn't have enough investment to sustain the rail network and grow it and make it the resilient transport network that it needs to be. Government has now invested substantially into the network and associated parts of what Kiwi Rail needs, including rolling stock, locomotives, and now the ships and the ferry terminals themselves. The focus really is getting that funding into Kiwi Rail to invest to make a greener, more sustainable, resilient, long-term transport network that supports economic growth and also tourism in the areas in which we operate. As we've worked through this project, I have to say that as always, we have a commercial relationship as Kiwi Rail with the port and in certain aspects with the council, but I'm really, really proud of the strong partnership we've established with Port Marlborough and Marlborough District Council over the last few years as we brought this project to the stage where we can consult with the community around the funding that's required. And Kiwi Rail's role in this process is really to support Port Marlborough and Marlborough District Council through that consultation process. I think it speaks to the relationship that we all have, and that we have some very aligned and common goals that KiwiRail is able to participate in this presentation. Reece did a few frequently asked questions, and one of the questions that we as KiwiRail often are asked is, do we as KiwiRail care about the Waitohi Picton community and the Marlborough area? And the answer is absolutely. Just like Port Marlborough and Marlborough District Council, we're here for the long term. We work and live in the community as well, and so we are part of your region just as much as you are, we believe. So now I'll just pass over to Massimo. He'll take us through a few details in terms of the ships. Thanks, Massimo.
Thank you, Stephen. My name is Massimo Soprano. I'm the Ships Program Manager of IREX. And as Stephen said tonight, what I'll do, I'll go through some of the key design considerations around the design of the new ferries, and then talk about some specific design solution that may be of interest, particularly to the Picton community. The two ferries are rail-enabled, passenger and freight ferries. They've been specifically designed for the Cook Strait ferries service. They are larger than any of the current ferries, and there are obviously reasons for that, because the fleet of Inter-Island in the future will go from 3 to 2 ships. And but of course there is a need to design the ships to fulfill capacity requirements for passengers, rail wagons, and commercial vehicles, and for cater for future growth of the business. There are also performance requirements that had to be fulfilled in terms of achieving an efficient speed-to-power ratio, and reduce as much as possible the wave energy generated in the Marlborough Sound. And we had to accommodate we had to design the ships to accommodate almost 2,000 passengers to be able to service Inter-Island with 2 ships. There are some benefits around the size of the ships. We have managed to achieve a very efficient speed-to-power ratio, and we have also achieved through the design to improve the seakeeping of the new ships in comparison with the current fleet, and significantly improve on wave energy, which I will talk into more details in a minute. The other key design consideration has been safety. The ships are designed to fulfill the requirement of the safe return to port regulations for passenger ships. And what that means is the safe return to port design is a goal-based approach, which requires the ships to be designed with a high level of arrangements, equipment, and system redundancy. So the level of redundancy that exists we will have on the new ships is significantly higher than the current vessel. And I will mention later on some example of this redundancy. The other area in the design in relation to safety has been health and safety in design, which has been the process and will continue through the next stages of the design to identify operational hazards and reduce risk to our passengers and crew through design solution. Another key design consideration has been the reduction of carbon emissions. And there've been a number of design solutions that we have considered as far as reducing carbon emissions. One is an efficient hull design. So we played with the dimension of the ships to optimize the performance of the ship. And the other outcome of an efficient hull design has been the reduction of wave energy. Power and propulsion efficiency is another key design consideration. The ships are will be fitted with 4 diesel generators. We will be able to operate the ships at service speed by running only 3 engines. So there is a redundancy there of 25% of the installed power, and the ships are fitted with Azimuth Thrusters, which can be described as pods fitted with a propeller capable to rotate 360 degrees. We came up with that solution of the Azimuth Thrusters after we went through a fairly comprehensive studies of different propulsion solution, and with the Azimuth Thrusters we have achieved the best speed and power performance, which means less fuel consumption and which means less emission. I will talk later on about what the maneuverability of the ship would be with Azimuth Thrusters. The power and propulsion system include a battery energy storage system with an initial installed capacity of 8.5 kilowatt, 8,500 kilowatt hours, and that enables actually to bring the ships into port and sailing from port on batteries, reducing smoke emissions, reducing noise, and the ships will be powered in port by batteries and shore power. Another key design consideration is resilience. We are a key part of the connections between the North and South Island, and the ships have been designed to maintain resilience operation in the event of a natural disaster. An example of that is the ship would be fitted with emergency stern ramps, which will enable the ships to be operating from other ports in the event that there was a natural disaster impacting either Wellington or Picton. Reliability of service was another key consideration. The high redundancy level is quite critical when you're running a 2-ship operation, and the ship had to be capable to maintain 3 return crossing per day. And the other thing that the other 2 things that we consider in the design, one is the customer experience. The business of Inter-Island is undertaking a transformation to become more and more customer-centric and efficient. Designing new ships specific for the New Zealand market gives us an incredible opportunity to provide a true New Zealand customer experience with a distinct look and feel through the interior of the new ships and the offerings on board the ships, and gives us also the opportunity, gave us the opportunity to work with local designers and with local iwis in terms of basically develop the branding for the future Inter-Island ships. And future-proofing is another thing that is a key consideration. We need to future-proof the design of the ship for future growth, but also we need to future-proof the ship for the development in technology and alternative fuel, carbon neutral fuel in future. And so we had to consider a design solution to allow that to happen over the life of the ship. In terms of carbon emissions, this has been a very important part in the design consideration. KiwiRail is committed to become carbon neutral by 2050 and to reduce carbon emission by 2030, by 30% by 2030. The new ships will achieve a fleet carbon emission reduction by 40% by day 1, which is a considerable improvement on the targets, and they are designed to allow increased use of battery in future. The project should be noted that the project has achieved green loan certification under the Climate Bonds Standards and Certification Scheme, which is used globally to prioritize investments which genuinely contribute to addressing climate change. So the green loan that was awarded to the KiwiRail investment is the first loan in its kind in the world of shipping globally. And in order to achieve that, we had to develop a managed reduction plan in order to prove a path to carbon neutrality by 2050. And basically, the managed reduction plan had to be developed for the life of the assets, 30 years, not just the life of the loan facility. And the managed reduction plan is based on electrification, which is basically increase the use of batteries over time. In relation to some of the more specific design consideration, design solution that may be of interest to the Picton community, one of them is wave energy. The wave energy generated by the new ship has been calculated as less than 50% of the energy generated by the Kaitaki, which is a vessel that is consented to operate in the Marlborough Sound and in the Queen Charlotte Sound at a speed over 15 knots. And this particular slide shows a comparison between the wave energy generated by the Kaitaki, which is on the bottom half of the green screen, versus the wave energy generated by the concept design hull, the hull of the concept design ship on the top part of the screen. You can see from that animation that in the complete range of speed between 16 knots and 20 knots, the new vessels will perform considerably better than the Kaitaki. In addition to that, we have also contractually agreed with the yard to have a pre-contract and a post-contract validation of this calculation through model testing. The first model testing was done before we signed the shipbuilding contract to give us and the shipyard comfort that the hull design was well within the specified wave energy limit. And the model test results confirm that the design of the hull proposed by the yard is actually going to slightly improve the original concept design as far as wave energy. Next slide, please. There are some specific solutions through the design that may be of particular interest for Picton and the Marlborough Sound. One is the design of the ship as far as safe return to port and some of the redundancies that come with the design of designing a ship to safe return to port. So effectively, the propulsion system is split, the control systems are split, and that really reduces effectively the risk of a failure to prevent the ship from returning to port safely. There is a third source of power, which are the batteries, that once again improve the overall redundancy in the design of the new system. The other thing to be considered is that the propulsion system of Azimuth Thrusters improve considerably the maneuverability of the ships. Azipods are particularly efficient in terms of reversing capability. They operate very efficient in terms of performance at low speed and astern. They enable the ship to turn in a very limited space, and they have far superior stopping capabilities than conventional propulsion system. What that means to Picton, it means that we can turn the ships at Mabel Island. We can actually turn the generators off, power the ships on batteries, turn the ships around on Mabel Island, and reversing them into berth in Picton on batteries. By doing that, there would be less impact on Picton Harbour traffic while berthing and unberthing than what we have at the moment. So these new ships, while they are bigger, are likely to actually impact less on harbour traffic. And the other thing is that the combination between Azimuth Thrusters and bow thrusters gives the ship a capability to, the ship can be held in position up to a wind speed of 45 knots plus 1 knot of current. So that is actually, it improves safety, but also improves the reliability of service in terms of being able to operate at higher limit of wind and current than current ships. We have done a number of marine simulation exercises over time to test some of the berthing solution, and to testing also the transit through the Torrey Channel. We have done that in the past in conjunction with the Harbour Master of MDC, Maritime New Zealand, PMNZ, and TATAO and our masters. Another important point to consider as far as the solutions through design that we don't have on the current ships and we will have on the new ships is how we enhance mass rescue capabilities. We are mindful of the fact that the ships are bigger, carry more passengers. There have been concerns in the past about mass rescue capabilities, and the ships have a number of design solutions that would certainly enhance their capabilities to evacuate the ships as well as assist other ships in rescue operations. A couple of examples is, one example is the ships will be fitted with emergency towing arrangements, so they will be able to tow other ships up to a certain capacity. They will be fitted with a marine evacuation system of a slides type, which means that is a system that can be used for evacuation, but can be also used, the slide can be used also used to retrieve or to rescue people from the water. And another example is that the ship will be built with a landing, an helicopter landing platform that would enable the largest New Zealand Defence Force helicopter, the NH-90 helicopter, to actually land on the ship. These are big helicopters. They can carry 20 seated passengers or 12 people in stretchers. Next, please. So just to conclude, the milestones for the ships, as you know, we went through an international multi-stage procurement process, which we started in late 2019, and it was concluded in June last year when we signed a shipbuilding contract with Hyundai Mipo Dockyard in South Korea for the 2 ferries, one to be delivered in August 2025, and the second one to be delivered in May 2026. Hyundai Mipo Dockyard is a shipyard owned by the Korean Shipbuilding and Offshore Engineering, which is the largest shipbuilding conglomerate in the world. There is a long design phase post-contract, and the design basically started after signing the contract. The construction of the ship will not start until March 2024. That timeline is pretty much driven by the need of aligning the completion of the ships with the completion of the terminal. So it's slightly longer than what you would normally expect in a project of this type. So we expect the first ship to arrive in New Zealand in September 2025 to undergo preparation for service and then fleet transition. And we picked that particular time of the year, mid-2025, is to align with the off-peak season. It's a lot easier to do an introduction and preparation to service during that period of time. So the plan is to have the first ship commission into service for the 2025-2026 holiday season. The ship transition will be managed by planning the progressive withdrawal of existing ships from service when the new ships are ready for service. So all of that will be managed in such a way that the service will never be disrupted. Inter Islander, I think we mentioned before, is undertaking a substantial business transformation to become more customer-centric. So there is a future operating model that has been developed with several initiatives to be implemented in the lead up to the introduction of the new assets as part of another program, which is the new Inter-Islander program. And we are working together with Inter-Islander on an integrated transition plan to coordinate. As you can imagine, there are a lot of parts of this program to be coordinated between us on the ship side, the terminals, the new Inter-Islander, just to make sure that everything is coordinated and the phasing out of the current fleet is planned properly. This is all from me tonight. So welcome any questions when we finish, and we'll stay online for that.
Thank you, Stephen, Massimo. Our next presenter is our Marlborough Harbour Master, Luke Grogan, who's also presenting remotely.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Luke Grogan, as mentioned, Marlborough Harbour Master. My apologies first up that I don't have enough bandwidth from where I am to be visible on the camera, but hopefully you can hear me okay. So just to kick things off, just a quick review. My role as Harbour Master is essentially to enable council to fulfil its obligation to ensure maritime safety in the region. So I come from a nautical background and essentially apply maritime expertise toward assessing matters of navigation safety in the region. So with this proposal to introduce new ships, it was essential to look very closely at existing operations and what we have learned about safe navigation in the region. Now, as soon as you do that, Tory Channel presents as a pretty significant area of risk in the harbour. So up there, you'll see that historically we have had some incidents. Some of them have been serious, and we've been lucky that we haven't had, in recent times at least, significant events, but we've come close in terms of the groundings and near groundings that we've had. In addition, we know we've had a number of ships that have had close quarter situations, engine failures, mechanical failures, and of course, going back in time, there was issues with the fast ferry wake and all that brought. Now, new ships, larger ships. So a basic concept is that the larger the ship, the more fuel it carries, the more people it carries, the more difficult it is to run a salvage operation if something goes wrong. So broadly speaking, we can say that the larger the ship, the more risk it carries. In saying that, there is a flip side to that, which is that more modern ships, as has just been outlined, tend to have a whole lot of design factors and capability that can actually increase safety. So a big part of the challenge that I've had and my team is to really look at that risk equation and try to understand exactly where we are. Now, in terms of the incidents that we've had here, it's pretty important to note that shipping incidents haven't been limited to just Marlborough or just Tory Channel. And in fact, this has been something of a national challenge that we've faced in New Zealand. And so quite recently, just going back to 2018, the Transport Accident Investigation Commission actually placed the movement of large ships in New Zealand waters on their watch list, which basically is a way of saying that all parties involved in the movement of big ships around the coast of New Zealand, be it government regulators, regional councils, ports, or other stakeholders, ship owners, etc., basically need to improve their game to increase maritime safety around the coast. So there was a bit of a running theme. Can I get the next slide, please? So in approaching this particular issue and how we would evaluate the risk for new ships, it was fortunate with that sort of national approach to improving maritime safety that there was a wide range of people getting involved to really understand what good practice and what best practice looks like when it comes to safe shipping. And a few examples of that, we've had a review of the Port and Harbour Safety Code, and the code is essentially a tripartite agreement between Maritime New Zealand. It includes all regional councils in New Zealand and all ports as well. And it basically sets out how we work together to manage maritime risk. Out of that, there's been some great guidance that's been produced in very recent times. So the Good Practice Guide to Pilotage and Passage Planning, really looking at how we should plan our passages in terms of ships navigating around the coast. And on top of that, another document called the Key Principles for Marine Risk Management. So really outlining what good marine risk management looks like within New Zealand ports and harbours. So really the point here is that as we've approached this challenge of the introduction of new ships in the Marlborough waterways, we've had this great guidance to lean on, and the support of other ports and harbours and the knowledge that's been developed over time in the New Zealand scene and internationally. So I should also mention that the focus hasn't been entirely on Tory Channel. That was really a starting point. But as we've pursued this program and project, we've started to recognise that in fact we need to review all aspects of the routes into Picton. Next slide, please. Right, so how are we doing that? So we've taken a real collaborative approach to risk assessment. And in fact, collaboration is one of the key principles of marine risk assessment as provided for in the guidance I mentioned earlier. And in the first phase, we've really brought together all the technical experts. So that includes pilots, masters of ships, hub masters, various consultants. And the intention is to agree in the first instance on a common and safe passage plan. So that process is presently underway. And if you see the image on the right there, you can see inbound and outbound tracks reflected by the green and purple. And so you can see that there's a fair bit of space that gets consumed if we look at the ferry transits as a whole. So a common passage plan approach has the potential of simplifying things somewhat and also potentially reducing the spatial demand in the waterways. So where we're at with that is that there's been some good work done to identify in the perspective of pilots and masters what optimal passages will look like. And that's now being reviewed by the New Zealand Maritime School. And we're also using a process of ship simulation to really make sure that we can assess with a degree of reality. So modelling these new ships of KiwiRail, that work's been done. So we have very accurate models which we can run through the simulator. We've done extensive work on making sure that we've got a very accurate understanding of tide. So we can couple that with good models of tide, good models of the ships, and start to get a really realistic understanding of exactly what's happening as ships pass through this space. So where will we get to? Ultimately, we will come to a point where the technical experts say, okay, here is a passage plan. Here are the routes into Picton. These are the controls that we need to have in place if this is going to work. And of course, the next phase is then to put that out for feedback from other users of the harbour. So it's all very well for those running ships and those technically inclined to say this is going to work, but there needs to be in the collaborative process that opportunity for input, as I say, from those other harbour users, so we can build a full picture of risk, and that may then lead to adjustment as to exactly what controls are used and how and where. And again, this aligns with the key principles of risk management, because it takes into account the needs of all users of the waterway, and also opens us up to consideration of social licence or community tolerance of risk. So the final phase, once that's been done and we've taken on board all of those wider issues, we'll then be at the point where I as Harbour Master will be in a position to propose bylaws, and I expect that will be around 2023. And essentially that's where we have a regulatory framework that then is enshrined to enable these ships to have that balance of industry-led regulation and also the ongoing monitoring of the regulator, which is MDC. Next slide, please. So some of the outcomes that we can expect to see in terms of regulation, none of this is decided yet. These are just things that are starting to bubble up through the process. So prescribed courses for ferries and ships in the region, additional controlled navigation zones. We currently have one at Tory Channel entrance, but there's likely a need for more. Restricted speed areas, restricted access areas at certain times, automated and continuous monitoring of speed, wake and adherence to operating parameters. That's currently underway and being tested, and the potential for immediate enforcement action for non-compliance, or at least the opportunity for a widespread awareness in real time and equally across management of the shipping companies, port and harbour. And existing projects underway. So as I mentioned, the Common Passage Plan project and simulation. We've recently had 3 tide stations installed in a collaborative project with KiwiRail, and creation of a virtual current meter and forecasting tool at this stage specifically for Tory Channel, but able to be extended across the entire national transportation route as pertains to Marlborough. Real-time wake monitoring. So great to see the design characteristics being built into the new ferries, but we also want to monitor that independently and be able to provide that feedback if a breach were to occur. And then routine and automated analysis of shipping transits to assess compliance with the agreed passage plan. So all those existing projects are underway at various stages of completion as we work toward basically building a more comprehensive system to ensure the ongoing safe transit of ships to and from Picton. And that's my final slide. So thank you very much, and very pleased to take questions at the end of this.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Our final presenter tonight is Laura Skelton, who's a senior transport planner with Marlborough Roads. Her presentation will be by way of a remote screen sharing presentation. So I'll hand over to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Right, so I'm the transport planner at Marlborough Roads, and I want to talk to you about some of the transport effects that you'll see within Picton and a little bit further beyond with the new ferries and the port redevelopment. So could I have my first slide, please? Next one. Yeah. Right, so as you know, there are currently 2 ferry companies that use the port. First of all, there's Blue Bridge, which is on the western side and accesses the port via Kent Street. I've shown that by the blue line. And I can now see that that's actually off centre slightly. I apologise for that. I hope that hasn't happened too much in my other slides. The Intra Islander is on the east and will access the port at the moment via Auckland Street for private cars, shown by the purple line, and Kent Street for larger vehicles. So next slide. So what you're seeing now is the typical seasonal patterns of the Intra Islander ferry loading. So this is for vehicles that are on the 12:30 sailing. The 12:30 sailing that arrives in Picton is the largest of the different sailings that happen on a daily basis. As you can see, the summer months carry more vehicles than the winter months, and the highest individual sailings coincide with public holidays. So you can see there Waitangi Day, Easter, Queen's Birthday, Labour Day, and quite a few peaks at Christmas. Additional sailings are also added during the Christmas peak to cover the demand due to limited capacity on individual ships. Next slide. So I've superimposed on the 2019 ferry sailings, the estimated 2029 data that was provided by Kiwi Rail. So as a whole, it's just natural increase that occurs, except at Christmas time when there's significantly more due to a suppressed demand. You will see that Easter and Anzac Day are slightly offset due to Easter changing from one year to the next. So that's why there's a little bit of a strange mess around March and April. If I could have the next slide. So with the future operations, the larger intra-island ferries will require the redevelopment of port, as we're all aware of, and that will actually alter the vehicle access as well. So Blue Bridge will remain in its present location, and the Intra-Islander will now use Kent Street for all vehicles entering and exiting the Marshall yards. So foot passengers to the Intra-Islander will continue to use Auckland Street, and drop-offs and rental vehicles will therefore continue to use their entry point here on Auckland Street. As a whole, this will reduce the flows on Auckland Street and increase the flows on Kent Street. Cars from the ferry that are visiting town will do so via Dublin Street. And at peak periods over the Christmas era time, Auckland Street will still continue to be used to ensure that turnaround times are maintained. Could I have my next slide? So several improvements are proposed to the road network as part of all these changes. The funding of each mitigation is shown based on the border of the call-out box in the diagram. So the items in red are being funded by council, and the items in green are either Waka Kotahi or Kiwi Rail. With the change in traffic volumes on State Highway 1, we'll relocate from Auckland Street to Kent Street. A new overbridge we've built at Dublin Street to mitigate the effects of the additional trains. The existing roundabout at the Kent Street and Dublin Street will be upgraded due to the additional vehicles coming out of the ferry. The existing intersection at Kent Street and Wairau Road will also be upgraded. The actual upgrading isn't finalised yet, but it will probably be a roundabout. It's been recommended to have safety improvements on both Kent Street and Wairau Road rail crossing. There's also been recommended for footpath improvements for both Kent Street and Auckland Street. So as you can see by the call-out boxes and the different colours, the majority of them are actually being funded externally to council. Thank you. Next slide. So looking into more detail of the Dublin Street overbridge, this is a preliminary design, so it's certainly not finalised. But you'll see that the bridge over the railway line will separate trains from vehicles, cyclists and also pedestrians. It will require, however, the closure of Market Street, so the people from Market Street will no longer be able to access Dublin Road. So the preliminary designs include 2 traffic lanes, 1 in each direction, a shared path on the northern side and wide shoulders. So cyclists will have the option of either using the northern shared path or staying on the road. Presently, there are about 4 trains a day, but I believe that will double in the future. Next slide. So while not part of the consultation being done at present, I know that there's a lot of concern about trucks parking overnight in Picton. So I thought I'd show you this slide to show you a bit about what's going on. A week-long parking survey was undertaken in June 2021 to estimate the level of truck parking in the local streets. The parking demand for the week is shown in the top graph. So the different colours represent the different colours of the day. The peak occurs at 2 AM on a Monday. The bottom graph shows the truck movements with arrivals in blue and departures in orange. The highest arrivals occurred at 6 PM and the highest departures at 5 AM. That's to meet the early sailing that leaves Picton. On the right shows the location where the trucks were parked during the peak time at 2 o'clock on the Monday. As you can see from that, about 1/3 of the trucks are parked in Nelson Square. There's a smaller amount in Dublin Street and again a smaller amount in the northern part of Kent Street, with the odd truck scattered in the other locations. So council is working with the Port and Kiwi Rail to see how truck parking can be better managed. The change in the ferry operation should not affect the number of trucks parking, except for that natural growth that I talked about before. So if I could have the next slide, please. I've also looked at the ferry effects further from Picton. The Transport Agency has a series of permanent traffic count sites on the state highway network, so I've extracted that data. And so these 2 graphs you can see show the 15-minute peak flow profile for a week in December. Each colour represents a different day of the week. The top graph shows the flows at the Picton site on State Highway 1. The large spikes that can be seen are an increase in flow due to the ferries arriving. The lower graph shows the count site in Blenheim for exactly the same week. So as you can see, by the time the spikes in Picton arrive at Blenheim, they've actually all levelled out. And most of them have disappeared by the time the traffic reaches Blenheim. It's partially because some vehicles go up Queen's Charlotte Sound, some people stay in Picton for a wee while, some people turn into State Highway 62 heading to Nelson, some people also stop in Blenheim itself. Could I have the next slide, please? So I've now extracted some 15-minute counts in more detail, and what you can see is it occurs between 11 AM and 4 PM. I've looked at the data in March for when the ferry loadings represent a typical summer's day. On the left is the actual 2019 flows, and on the right I've estimated what the flows would be in 2029 based on the estimated ferry loadings that it was provided by Kiwi Rail, which you saw in my earlier slide. I've also allowed for a natural growth for the other time periods. So the red line in both graphs shows the flows on State Highway 1 at Picton, and that's approximately where Nelson Square is. The orange line shows the flows on Kent Street. Dark blue shows the flows on State Highway 1 at Koromiko. So as you can see in both slides, there is a distinct peak that occurs there. The light blue line shows the flows on the Apawa Bridge just north of Blenheim Town Centre, and the light green line shows the flows on Main Street at Park Terrace, just south of the CBD. And as you can see, there is a slight rise, but then the increase in flows is very marginal, and it sort of ties in with the previous graph that I showed you. If you compare the left and the right-hand graphs, you can see that there is an increase in demand, but most of that, like I said, is due to the natural growth in the ferry sailings. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what I've done is I've also looked at late December, like I said previously, that this is when the biggest impact will be made in respect with the new ferries. So because that's when the ferry demand is at their peak, and also there's considered to be a suppressed demand at the moment. So the estimates for the late December in 2029 have quite a big increase. If you look at the flows on the orange, you can see that's Kent Street. And this time with Auckland Street, there is actually an increase as well, because there will be demands on Auckland Street. And Koromiko also, as you can see, is quite a significant increase. But this is only over a 30-minute period, and then the flows settle back down to normal flows almost immediately after that. The flows at Blenheim, the light blue and the light green at Apawa and Park Terrace also increase, but not as significantly, and they are much more spread out by the time the vehicles get there. The effect shown in this slide will only occur on a few days a year. It's estimated this will be less than 5 times a year by 2029, and maybe 20 times a year by the time it's 2040. So that's my last slide. Happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much to all our presenters. Did a great job explaining things. It's quite a complex project, so we've attempted to cover the key points of each of our presenters' area of expertise rather than trying to get into too much detail. However, we really welcome questions between now and if you're considering making a submission, to try and help you with that. But thanks anyway, presenters. Now, we've only had 4 questions in. So the first one, which is a good question, for the Mayor, if the public submission process were to overwhelmingly reject the proposed loan of 110 million, where would that leave MDC and its 100% owned subsidiary Port Marlborough, New Zealand? Would you do it anyway?
One of those what if questions, and I'm going to answer it like this. Councillors approach the consultation and the deliberation process with an open mind. So ultimately it's going to be a decision of full council. So I can't presuppose the way that that may end up panning out. What I will say is that we invite community participation in this process. It's important that we as a council provide full, free and frank information to enable informed feedback and ultimately informed submissions. Submissions are not just about those opposed to MDC participation in this project. We also invite submissions in favour of the participation, as we've outlined tonight. In summary, good decisions are always the result of good research and information. So anyone that's considering making a submission, can I ask you to please read the statement of proposal? I'd suggest even having a look at the presentations from tonight, which will be available on the website, and making your submissions. But I'm going to repeat myself. We invite submissions. We want to hear from the community at large about how they feel about this project. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Second question talks about the loans and interest. Under the proposal, council raises the borrowing with the local government finance agency, and then on-lends those funds to Port Marlborough. Will the interest rate between council and Port Marlborough be mirrored to the local government finance rate, or will council build in additional cover to a slightly higher rate of interest between it and Port Marlborough, rather than simply passing it through at the same rate? And that's a question for our Chief Financial Officer, Martin Fletcher. Martin.
Thanks, Mark. I think in answering this question, the first thing we have to remember is this: we're all part of one group. It's Council, NBC Holdings and Port Marlborough. As a result, we're planning to on-lend at cost. And the reasons for that is there is actually no benefit to the group in total by actually adding a margin otherwise, because if we add a margin on to the cost to Port Marlborough, it reduces the amount of profit they make and the amount of dividends we get. Conversely, it also actually allows them to have a slightly bigger tax deduction. But conversely though, the extra income that council gets is taxed. So the end result is actually a neutral position. So that's why we've taken the simple approach of actually just on-lending at cost. Keeps it much, much simpler, much more straightforward, much easier to understand.
Thanks, Martin. I'll now go to a question that we actually have received by way of submission. So it actually came in prior to this, but it's a good question, and I've heard comment about this around the community. So this question is, can council raise some of the 110 million locally through an infrastructure bond available only to New Zealand Marlborough citizens?
Right. Firstly, I think if it would be great that locals had sufficient confidence in this project that they're prepared to invest their own money into it. That'd be absolutely fantastic. However, from a finance hat, I'd actually be recommended to council that they use the government financing agency to finance this project and not actually extend their offer to individual people. The main reasons for this is actually simplicity. And if borrowing from the local government financing agency, we're only borrowing from one organisation as compared to, and as a result of that, we're only paying, only having to manage one relationship and only having to pay the interest to one particular organisation. You compare that with actually loaning to or seeking funds from individuals. There's a whole regulatory regime we'd have to comply with, and that includes issuing a prospectus, having a prospectus audited, establishing a subscription regime, engaging a broker, and so forth. So it's actually quite a costly exercise as well as actually a very timely one. The other thing is also that in the document that's been worked through between QRL and Port Marlborough, there's actually a 2-year interest reset provision. Basically what that means is if interest rates move over a 2-year period, then the agreement can also move at the same time. Therefore, to minimise risks, the best way to do that is to have your investments at the borrowing at the same time frame as well. Typically, private individuals want to take bonds out for much longer periods. The other thing to point out is that the LGFA does actually source the majority of its funds domestically. So even though it may not be a direct relationship between the individual and council, individuals through the institutions that the LGFA deal with can still actually make a contribution towards this project.
Thanks, Martin. There's a related question, just a simple question. does Port Marlborough pay the cost of consultation process? And I think the questioner is wanting to know why council pays some things and Port Marlborough pays other things.
Right. As I said at the beginning, I think we need to look at this as we are one big group out of this. And we each, within that group though, we each have our individual roles. And the role of council is actually to raise finance for this particular project if it's decided to go ahead with it. And council has to comply with the requirements of the Local Government Act. So as a result of that, that's why council is paying for the cost of this consultation.
Thank you. The last question, which I will answer, and I'll simplify the question. It was a reasonably long question. If the ferries are part of the national transport route, what share of the terminal costs will be paid by NZTA as the government agency responsible for NZ's state highways? So the funding of state highways is reasonably complex, as is the funding of rail. Rail, up until the last government's change in policy, was not funded through the National Land Transport Fund, whereas state highways and local roads, a share of local road funding did come through the National Land Transport Fund. The previous government changed that, so that was the Labour coalition, and NZ First were quite a driver in terms of government investment in rail. So they changed the policy, and now there is much more investment in rail, which includes the ferry link. State highway components that are required, upgrades that are required as a result of this project, are being funded by NZTA. So NZTA is involved in the funding of some of the consequences of this project. And that, as is Kiwi Rail. I hope that answers that question. That's all we've got tonight. So we welcome other questions to be sent to us, and just go to that email address. As we've said before, go to the website and get involved in the process. We may see some of you on Wednesday night or at the drop-ins on Thursday. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.